So my background and most of my time is actually spent where things are not working. And the reason things are not working is sometimes because of our frameworks and our processes and our systems, but fundamentally it's because there are attributes about people, how they think, how they act, and therefore how they're managing the associated risk. When you are inside an organization, it can be very difficult for lots of good reasons to see why things are not working or the areas where things are not working. Because if you think about businesses, how we operate, very focused on actions, activities, we track metrics. And so all our attention is framed at what we're doing and what's working. And we don't really have, and you've hit the nail on the head, Peter, around the level of change with the prudential requirements. There are so many requirements, so many expectations, so much busy work that is designed to uplift those minimum standards. But it means we don't have the time, space, reflection to actually take a step back and go, what's not working? Where am I not seeing that? And that's where issues and incidents manifest. And, if they're big enough, people go, hang on a minute, organizationally, why did this happen? And
Yeah.
that's where we end up coming in.
Because I can't help feeling as you were talking, Tamara, that you've got an issue that people could get so hang up with complying that they end up in a tick the box scenario rather than seeing what is the problem we're trying to address here.
Yeah. And when you get into big organizations, it often, we have very, very clear accountabilities defined. So a person, a business unit, a team picks up 234, 235, runs with it, designs processes, systems, even capability uplift programs to help people meet the requirements of the standard. But quite often that can be absent of the broader context in which people are operating, which is why you get a tick box approach. I think the other thing that's really interesting to think about is any prudential standard is designed on a principles basis and therefore articulates the minimum requirements. So what does that mean in terms of how we go above and beyond? But I do find quite a lot you get this layering of different processes and systems for different standards, often not well integrated, often not well understood. And people, all the people running our operations, doing our business, they keep working the way they've always done. Sometimes they'll have another activity on the end, but if it's not integrated, it's fundamentally very difficult to drive the change that you want to see by having a particular program. So if you think about cyber, you can see how that would play out because the control mechanisms are probably very well intentioned, well designed, but then you get into how is that operating effectiveness piece working, and do I have the right things in place not only for the control to work at a conceptual level, but do I have the right signals to understand how people work and to identify failure fast?
Because I can't help feeling with compliance, what you want is it to almost be seamless. It's almost how you work, rather than thinking consciously, I've got to do something now to comply with a standard. And it's changing that behavior. And with so many different standards there, do I have to pick the favorite? Do I have to say I'm going this way rather than that way? Because the whole standard of compliance implies to me you've got to comply with everything.
It does. And so you think about how a person at an operational level works. Do we expect them to know the specific requirement in the standard? Or to your point, have we designed our system in a way that it's integrated to the way that they work? And have we equipped them with both the understanding, but also, I guess, the awareness to talk about things where they don't see it working in practice? A really good example in one of the we were doing a review. We talked to people about, lots of people across lots of different businesses around examples of where they think, what happens when you see a potential, something that's not what it should be. So I was talking to a person and they said, well, I identified we had a non-production environment touching a production environment. So like they had the curiosity to go or notice that that's not right. And then you get into the system of issues and incidents reporting. Where do you put it? They sought guidance, and the questions that came back, well-intended, well-designed frameworks were, well, you know, what's the impact? Is there a regulatory impact? Not work through the question set. And there was no impact because nothing had happened yet. And so it didn't go in the system. Now, I would think like that's kind of important intelligence that people want to act on. But unless we really understand what's driving decision making at those levels and the cultural factors, the best processes and systems are almost a bit like kabuki theatre. And then executives look at their processes and go, well, we've got all the processes, we've got the assurance, but they miss that understanding of how people work in practice.
Well, and there's an implication there also, Tamara, that it's only when when it blows up that people respond. If you're conscious that it's a deficiency, but it's not causing you impact, you tend to leave it before it becomes a crisis. You don't nip it in the bud.
Yeah, or you leave it because in the scheme of things, you think, well, I have far bigger priorities because lots of companies are dealing with aged assets, legacy technology, different systems where the inherent risk is higher. So you quite rightly make a decision to prioritize whatever needs to be done to make that secure or, in fact, get onto a new system. But you can't lose sight of these other things and have those mechanisms to go, actually, this thing that I might have risk accepted it, knowing that I've got 3 months, I've got 6 months till I'm off that. If something changes here, I also need that balance of signals in case I do need to reprioritize. But often that's not well connected, it's not well understood, and we don't have the time and space to think about it.
Okay. Now, Tamara, you spent 15 years at APRA. What's the best way for organizations to work effectively with APRA? They could see you as the police, and so they sort of want to keep a low light. Or is it feasible to look at APRA as an engagement, not a sort of is there some harmony that you can have in that engagement?
Absolutely. And I think an open and constructive relationship with the regulator will drive better outcomes, not just at the individual company level, but for the stability of the system. So as a regulator, APRA would see many, many different processes across lots of different organisations. They have an intelligence from looking at the financial sector as a whole, which means there's really good insight. And if you start to have those open and engaging and constructive discussions with the regulator, it actually helps you form better decisions, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is getting a different perspective or a new piece of information or insight. And remember, they're not just looking at Australia. There's a lot of forums to interact internationally as well. And I think that level of discussion can be hugely helpful for institutions in the regulated space, but you have to be prepared to engage in the outset.
Yeah, well, you're talking there about having sort of best practice insights about how to do it, because and that will give you, for want of a better term, templates about how you could go about it in your own organization.
Yeah, and if you think about, exactly my own career journey, you see where it doesn't work. So you have those lessons learned that may not be available through industry forums or through various discussion and working groups that happen. And it gives you an additional lens of how to think about things, but also going back to the prudential framework is principles based, to have that deeper understanding of the principles, which will help you be more compliant with them in terms of how you operationalize them.
Okay. Now, you wanted to talk about FAR, but you also wanted to talk about, but I also want to talk about CPS 234 before we get there. It's just, and the reason I say that, I've run 2 roundtable executive events for ADAPT this year on CPS 234, sponsored by different vendors. And they've been oversubscribed. I mean, I've had people, a room that fits 20, I've had 24 people smoke. So there's obviously some sort of anxiety about what this might entail within people. What is your perspective of that? And what do you think? Go on.
I'm really curious what the area of questioning was and why there was a level of anxiety. Like, what were the things really bubbling on people's minds?
Well, I say anxiety, not that people expressed anxiety to me, but the fact that the evidence that when it can often be very hard to get people to give up time to come to an event, to have something oversubscribed for two different events, one in Melbourne, one in Sydney, gives me some insight. Actually, the Sydney one, I did one in Melbourne and one in Sydney with one vendor, and a different vendor I did in Sydney. All
Mhm.
three were oversubscribed. So that tells me there must be something about this that
Yeah.
people have niggling away at them. So, now, the people who would have attended would have been risk executives in these scenarios, so they weren't cyber execs. So again, that tells me that there must, was it that it's imminent that made them come along, or was it they think it's going to be an onerous impact on them?
I think it's probably a combination of both. So it's interesting. I know APRA has released some insights about the CPS 234 tripartite process. And, I think that those observations and even the style of the review, what they're really doing is focusing on the governance around these aspects. But the people coming to your forum are highly conscious of the fact that the inherent level of risk related to these concepts in CPS 234 is very, very high. And when you have very high levels of risk, there is probably always going to be an area where the risk will manifest. And so now you have an overlay of regulatory expectations and requirements. So I can understand where people would be thinking, you can do everything, meet all the requirements in the standard, but the inherent risk level is just so high. We feel like, I imagine, something's not going to work. So how do we get ahead of that, and how do we prevent that from occurring?
Okay, I'm just thinking, Tamara, that the audience will primarily be cyber execs.
Yeah,
It is a security conference rather than,
yeah,
but cyber dominates the discussion in lots of areas.
yeah,
But when you talk things like principles and concepts, I might need you just to elaborate a bit
yeah,
more for the uninitiated in the
yeah,
audience about that
mhm,
sort of stuff.
yeah, will do.
But from what you're seeing, is there anything really different about this, or is CPS 234 upping the notch in these areas?
All of these things are deliberately designed to make sure that we are increasing the expectation around how organisations are managing this risk. So,
Yeah,
absolutely, there is an increase in the level of expectations, quite rightly so, because of the nature of the risk and how it's evolving, and to ensure that there's concentrated focus on cyber, particularly given the events of the past 12 to 24 months.
yeah,
It really is a case not of if, but when. And so the preparedness element around that is really important as well. And even, thinking about the various case studies, how fast can you identify that it's happening? How quickly can you intervene and take action? And it doesn't matter how well culturally organizations run scenarios in practice, it is different when you are making the decision and it's real life.
yeah, yes,
So
yeah,
understanding your risk culture, how people identify these, raise it fast with the sufficient level of attention. So it's not just about it's not just an identification problem, it's also an intervention problem. So how quickly do we intervene and make a decision to act? And that will be underpinned by cultural factors around decision making, accountability, the level of constructive challenge and open dialogue within firms. And I think, it's not just one standard in isolation, it's about the whole. And, the best experience we ever get is from where we've made a mistake.
yeah.
And short of having that, how do we ensure that our culture is responsive to lessons learned so that we are continuously improving and making sure that we are pulling in the things that we need to that help us better manage the risk at the end of the day?
Okay, but Tamara, there's always an element of risk management, always entails some form of conscious decision making. We'll do this and we won't do that. What are the sort of guardrails that you make risk management decisions with so high expectations on? Is there some guardrails that you can sort of get some sense of grip on what you need to do?
It's interesting that you say that, because my observation from working with a lot of teams across the financial services sector is that we do spend a lot of time thinking about risk management and what we're doing. I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about the trade-off of what we're not doing as a
Yeah.
result. What is the risk of not doing something? By doing X, what are we not doing about Y? And I don't think that that happens as much as it should. And people place a lot of reliance on process and systems and assurance. I don't know that we're as curious or as critical about what's driving good assurance or good process, and spending the time to think about that and explore it, because wherever there is a gap, that can give rise to issues and incidents. So I think we take a lot of comfort in the fact that we've got all the things we need to have in place,
Yeah.
and perhaps less time around how are they actually working effectively. I know last time we spoke about the ISO accreditation. There are different levels of accreditation providers. What is the quality? Executives, boards will place reliance on our assurance, but do we spend time thinking about what is the quality of the assurance provider?
Yeah.
You can see great examples coming out and I mentioned those at the CPA event, about varying standards of quality of audits globally. A lot of listed firms, you take Wirecard in Germany, they were audited. They had audited financial statements. We've placed reliance on a brand name audit, but it
Yeah.
didn't uncover the issues. So I think that broader systems thinking is really fundamental, and understanding that it's an important component of managing your risk, in addition to the processes, the systems, and the compliance.
Because what I'm hearing you say, it's not blindly following a process and say, we've done this. It's actually sort of having a process of decision making to say, this is what we think here. This is why we're doing this. This is why we're going to postpone doing that. It's that
Yep.
sort of stuff that the regulator will be looking for you, rather than, oh, we did what we were told.
Yeah, absolutely. And maintaining that environment that fundamentally is underpinned by curiosity, because the landscape shifts so quickly. So not just a set and forget decision, but decision-making processes and rhythms within the organisation that help you continuously challenge yourselves about the risks, about the decisions, about the assurance, as you see different parts adapt. And so if I think back then to what is the link that I would be worried about as it relates to FAR, is that it's not just about complying and having an accountability statement or map, but it fundamentally comes down to how organisations are making decisions. And it's making decisions around things like finding and fixing problems, about testing and challenging decisions, about the context in those decisions, and then fundamentally at the end of the day, really understanding the risk culture in the organisation and how that shapes how a various process, system, or policy is operationalised, and that ongoing loop of lessons learning. And I think listening to the language from the conference, the AFR conference, I think it was, the impost on the board that was coming out of ASIC was very much reasonable steps, which has a specific meaning within the FAR legislation, but it's that we expect directors to be taking reasonable steps in addition to management teams, and that that can drive a lot of industry and process to evidence things. Unintended consequences, you lose sight on what really matters, and how organisations strike a balance around this will ultimately determine how successful they are in managing the risk.
Yeah, and you talked there about governance, because what I'm hearing also, there's formal governance through things like boards and stuff like that, but there's always a lot of informal governance where there's got to be engagement between the risk people and the board executives outside these meetings. So maybe you're alerting and advising what are some good practices you see in the area of informal governance?
I think at the end of the day, when I think about governance and governance being effective, it's about having the right information, get to the right people at the right point in time so they can make the right decisions with the right controls in place to identify failure
Yeah.
fast. And that is governance, which is shaped by your formal mechanisms, but is also shaped by your informal mechanisms, relationships between people. And fundamentally, what we're talking about is the culture around managing risks.
Okay, okay, because as you were saying there, I couldn't help feeling that the foundation stones for those governance are often formed informally by risk executives going to board managers, getting a perspective on those things, talking to counterparts and perhaps in IT for reporting and that, and creating the frameworks that then become the process.
Absolutely. And I think, the risk teams, risk functions will perform one part around frameworks and processes, but the financial service industry is very much anchored to the three lines of defence in which the business owns the risk. So, as well as the risk executives and the cyber executives understanding these things and taking action, a really important element is what are those business unit leaders doing who fundamentally own the risk at the end of the day?
Yeah, yeah.
Is it
The
clear?
end, is it clear what the risk is and who's got responsibility?
Yeah, and what points are they relying on? So most organisations that I would walk into, for instance, a very typical response would be who owns data risk, and you'd get the finger pointing.
Yes, yes, yes,
Right?
yeah.
So organisationally, do we actually understand who owns the risk? Who are they relying on end to end to help them managing the risk? And how do they know that what the assumptions about what these people are doing or these divisions that they rely on are performing it to the level of that's expected?
Have you got any anecdotes there, Tamara, that you might share about organizations which have actually consciously found a way? I'm sure it's not just meeting,
Yeah.
I own the data risk. There's a sort of agreement somewhere. Have you got any anecdotes there you could share?
Let me think about that specifically in the context of data risk,
Yeah.
because it's hard to come up with a good example because it's still, I find, very nascent around what is data risk, who owns the data element, who's responsible for mapping the lineage, do we know where it comes from, what's sitting in legacy systems. It's very much still a work in progress. From an accountability perspective, I do remember having a discussion with one executive who was very, very clear that they owned data risk. Now, it didn't mean that they were responsible for doing everything across a very large organization to manage data risk, but they knew those key dependencies and those key points where they were relying on people to do things on their behalf. And they were very conscious about making sure those people had, not even in their reporting line, but had appropriate resourcing, appropriate risk systems and reporting in place, and the things that then therefore helped them satisfy themselves that they were doing what they needed to do to meet that accountability. But
Okay.
I'll think of a good news story and a bad news story.
Okay, that would be good because I can see data risk would be actually would resonate with a cyber audience because especially after those attacks last year, I mean the exposure was data and customer confidentiality rather than financial. So I think that would be of interest to them, and it would. I know APRA is focused primarily on the financial services industry, but it would resonate with a broader audience, and there will be a broader audience there.
Yeah. I had this morning, I had lunch with a friend yesterday, and we went to a place I've never been to before, and he and it was quite nice. And then he went back to his office and he said, "You won't believe it. I've got back and there was some other lunch on and it's been catered by this place on Bridge Street." We're like, wow, what a coincidence. And then this morning, going through social media feeds on the train, I had an ad for that particular place, and I sent him a text and I said, I have given away so much access to my data. Like, here's an example. And
Yeah.
I wonder, when you think about organisations managing these risks, individually they might fit under data, they might fit under cyber, but at the end of the day, they are going to manifest themselves in reputational risk incidents.
Yeah.
And understanding the impact and what's likely to play out, particularly from a broader expectation, societal perspective around social license and people who hold these different types of data, because most of us will go through any app, we just tick the box, yes, I agree to the terms and conditions. But there will come some point in the future where we start to have the realization that I've ticked way too many boxes. And, that will prompt a very interesting social license question around the expectations that we have of big service providers who hold some form of data about us. And if you're not ahead of the curve in thinking about those things, that's a really big reputational risk,
Yeah.
like
And
emerging future state.
and I can't help feeling, Tamara, that reputational risk is actually probably a good engagement point for people. You say data risk and people think, oh, that's technology or something like that. But if you translate it back to it, in the end, it's reputational risk regarding here. And we've got to take ownership of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And, at the end of the day, you can look both here and overseas. Qantas is a great example, right? So they've made decisions that are having significant reputational impacts.
Yeah.
And then you think about, you cost those out, including management and board time, appearances at committees, preparation, all of those different aspects have actually manifest themselves in financial costs for any given organisation. And when I think about, just our predisposition to tick a box and move on so that we can have the immediate now, longer term, the reputational impacts from these various different risks, I do think there will be a higher obligation, a higher societal expectation on companies that handle any kind of data. So it's
Can you trust them? Can you trust them? I mean, I certainly say that with vendors. I mean, I'm certainly saying with one of my health funds, because I was a Medibank customer, and do I trust them? But Qantas is also interesting because in some ways the share price of Qantas was high when they were doing all these risks and focused on that. And when they've gone off and started to say we need to change, it's taken a hit. So the investment community doesn't always reward good practice. They sometimes reward bad practice.
Well, it's, when the sunlight is the best disinfectant, right?
Yeah.
So it's only when these things actually become known and known broadly that you start to have those reactions and the conversation shifts to all that. Expectations shift, that's not actually good enough anymore. And I think that's, probably one of the biggest, we were discussing last time, takeaways. One of the biggest takeaways is good enough is no longer good enough.